In October 1999, a 23-month-old girl named Andrea Michelle Reyes was reported missing from New Haven, Connecticut. Her disappearance was not at the hands of a stranger, but through what authorities call a parental abduction. Andrea was taken by her non-custodial mother, Rosa Maria Tenorio, and vanished without a trace. For Andrea's father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, the disappearance of his daughter began a search that stretched on for decades. He filed police reports, worked with investigators, and made repeated attempts to locate Andrea as the years went by. Despite his efforts, the case went cold. International boundaries, limited cooperation at the time, and the lack of advanced technology made it nearly impossible to track her movements in the early years. For law enforcement, the case became part of a long list of unresolved parental abduction files. The FBI and Interpol were alerted, but leads dried up quickly. Andrea grew older in an unknown location, while her father was left without answers. By the mid-2000s, Andrea's case was considered a long-term missing child case. Each year, advocates for missing children reminded the public of families like the Reyes family, but very little progress was made. Carlos, however, did not give up. In interviews, he explained that even without clear leads, he held on to the belief that his daughter was alive. 2 decades later, technology began to change the landscape of cold cases. The rise of forensic genealogy, the use of DNA testing to connect biological relatives, opened possibilities that had not existed when Andrea disappeared. In 2023, a detective in New Haven, Keelan Nivikoff, revisited Andrea's case. Working with Othram, a Texas-based forensic laboratory specializing in difficult DNA cases, investigators began searching for matches that could confirm Andrea's identity. In early 2025, officials confirmed what Carlos had hoped for all along. Andrea had been located in Puebla, Mexico, and DNA testing confirmed that she was the child who had disappeared in 1999. After 25 years, she was alive and had reconnected with her father, while her mother, Rosa Tenorio, remains at large and wanted on charges of kidnapping. Andrea's identification closed one of Connecticut's longest-running missing child cases. The discovery demonstrates how persistence and modern forensic tools can resolve cases that once seemed impossible to solve. This is the story of a toddler taken across borders, a father's decades-long search, and the eventual return of answers more than 2 decades later. Andrea and her family, Andrea Michelle Reyes, was born in 1998 in New Haven, Connecticut. She was the daughter of Carlos Reyes-Couvertier and Rosa Maria Tenorio. At the time of her birth, her family situation was already complicated. Andrea's parents had separated, and her father held legal custody of her. Rosa did not have full custodial rights, and this created ongoing tension within the family. Andrea was just under 2 years old when she disappeared. Family members recall her as a playful toddler with the bright, curious energy that children bring into a home. While the public knows Andrea mostly through the case that defined her childhood, to her father, she was his little girl, someone he wanted to raise, protect, and see grow. Her father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, was deeply devoted to her. When Andrea vanished, Carlos became the central figure in the search. Over the years, he worked tirelessly to keep the case alive, even when leads grew cold. For him, Andrea was never forgotten. News reports describe how Carlos repeatedly pursued new paths to find his daughter, writing letters, making appeals, and staying in contact with authorities whenever possible. Andrea's mother, Rosa Maria Tenorio, had a different role in the story. Rosa lived in Connecticut in the late 1990s, but by October 1999, she was preparing to leave the United States. According to law enforcement records, she took Andrea during a period when she did not have custody. What may have been seen at first as a custody violation quickly escalated into a federal investigation once Rosa left the country with Andrea. Authorities charged her with kidnapping, and she has remained wanted ever since. The case drew early attention because of the child's age. Infants and toddlers who go missing often receive wide coverage, but Andrea's case became much more difficult once investigators realized she had been taken across borders. In the late 1990s, cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities was limited, and international parental abduction cases often stalled. The resources available today, global databases, digital alerts, and forensic genealogy, did not exist then. For Andrea's family, this meant years of waiting without progress. Andrea's relatives in Puerto Rico and the U.S. mainland described her disappearance as a deep wound that never healed. Her father spoke about her often, keeping her memory alive even as time passed. Carlos's persistence became one of the most striking aspects of the case. Unlike some cases where families eventually withdraw from public appeals, he continued searching, even decades later. For Andrea, the early years of her life were spent outside of her father's care. Although details of her upbringing in Mexico remain private, the confirmed reports show that she lived most of her life in Puebla, where she grew into adulthood without contact with her father. What is known is that she built a life there, separate from the family she left behind in 1999. This family background highlights the central conflict that defined the case: a young child taken during a custody dispute, a parent determined to find her, and a long wait for resolution. Andrea's disappearance was not a random crime, but an act carried out within her own family, which made the search more difficult and the eventual resolution more meaningful. By understanding who Andrea was and the circumstances of her family in 1999, we can better follow the story of how her case unfolded and why it remained unresolved for so long. The disappearance, October 1999. On October 19, 1999, the lives of everyone connected to Andrea Michelle Reyes changed. Andrea was just 23 months old when she disappeared from New Haven, Connecticut. The person who took her was not a stranger, but her non-custodial mother, Rosa Maria Tenorio. At the time, Andrea's father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, had legal custody. Rosa did not have the right to take Andrea out of his care, but despite this, she left with the toddler. The situation quickly escalated from a custody dispute into a serious missing child case when authorities realized Rosa had likely crossed into Mexico with Andrea. The initial reports show that police were notified soon after Andrea went missing. Carlos raised the alarm immediately. As a father with custody, he knew that Rosa taking Andrea was unlawful and dangerous. Law enforcement treated the case as a family abduction, but because Rosa left the country, it became far more complicated than most domestic custody violations. From the beginning, investigators faced major challenges. In 1999, international parental kidnapping cases often stalled. There were no streamlined global databases, no forensic genealogy tools, and limited coordination between U.S. and Mexican authorities. Once Rosa crossed the border, Andrea's trail grew faint. The FBI became involved early on because Rosa had taken Andrea across international lines. An arrest warrant was issued for Rosa, charging her with kidnapping. However, despite the warrant, locating her proved nearly impossible. In those days, alerts did not spread instantly across the internet the way they do today. Missing child posters and bulletins were created, but without fresh leads, the case slowed. Andrea's disappearance left Carlos in a state of helplessness. One moment his daughter was at home in New Haven, and the next she had vanished into another country. He appealed to authorities and asked for help through every available channel, but progress was limited. Investigators learned that Rosa had family connections in Mexico and believed she had settled there with Andrea. Still, without modern technology, tracking her was a struggle. Leads would appear and disappear, often unconfirmed. Tips that Andrea had been seen in different parts of Mexico surfaced occasionally, but none led to her recovery. For the community in New Haven, Andrea's disappearance was another reminder of how fragile custody situations could turn into long-lasting tragedies. While stranger abductions often dominated headlines, parental abductions were also devastating. The distinction didn't make the pain less for Carlos, who was left behind. Over the years that followed, Andrea's case was kept open but with little active development. The file remained with New Haven police and the FBI, but without cooperation from Mexican authorities or technological breakthroughs, investigators had few options. Rosa remained a fugitive, and Andrea was effectively missing without a trace. For Carlos, the disappearance in 1999 marked the beginning of a decades-long search. He never stopped pushing for answers. He believed Andrea was alive and somewhere out there, even when others began to lose hope. Each year that passed made the case colder, but he refused to let her memory fade. Andrea's disappearance in October 1999 was the critical turning point in the story. What began as a custody violation quickly grew into a 25-year mystery. At the time, no one could have known it would take until 2025 before answers would finally come. Early search efforts, 2000-2005. In the first years after Andrea's disappearance, the search for her was urgent but extremely difficult. From 2000 to 2005, her father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, pushed for answers while investigators tried to keep the case active. The New Haven Police Department and the FBI kept Andrea A.'s case open under the category of international parental abduction. Rosa Maria Tenorio, Andrea's mother, was listed as a fugitive. Federal charges were filed against her, and an arrest warrant was entered into the system. Rosa was accused of violating custody orders and of taking Andrea out of the United States illegally. Despite this, locating Rosa and Andrea proved almost impossible. In the early 2000s, there were no advanced tools like forensic genealogy or international DNA databases. Investigators had to rely on Interpol notices, border checks, and limited communication between agencies. Once Rosa settled in Mexico, she disappeared from official view. Carlos, however, refused to give up. He reported Andrea's disappearance to every agency he could. He stayed in touch with law enforcement, submitted her case to missing child organizations, and kept her photo active on missing children databases. According to reports, he never stopped reminding officials that his daughter was still out there. During this time, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, listed Andrea's case, keeping her face in circulation. Missing child posters were distributed, though updates rarely came. Carlos leaned on these organizations for support, but he often felt alone in the fight. The early search years were marked by frustration. Carlos explained in later interviews that he followed up on countless leads, but none led him to Andrea. Rumors surfaced from time to time that she had been spotted in Mexico, but nothing was confirmed. Without digital systems or quick international verification methods, most tips went nowhere. For law enforcement, Andrea's case was one of many parental abductions on record. In the United States, thousands of children are taken by non-custodial parents each year. Some are returned quickly, but others vanish for decades. Andrea's case fell into the latter category, making progress nearly impossible without cooperation from Mexico. By 2005, 6 years after Andrea disappeared, the investigation had grown cold. Rosa had not been found, and Andrea remained missing. For the police, it was an unresolved file. For Carlos, it was a wound that never healed. He continued to push, but resources for international cases were limited. Still, Carlos's determination stood out. Unlike many families who eventually stopped searching publicly, he kept Andrea's story alive. He marked her birthdays, anniversaries of her disappearance, and continued to speak her name. His persistence would later prove to be the thread that kept the case from being completely forgotten. The early years, though frustrating, established the groundwork for what would happen decades later. Without Carlos's continued involvement and the official record kept open by law enforcement, Andrea's story might never have reached the point of resolution. Living as Cold Case, 2006-2019. By the mid-2000s, Andrea Michelle Reyes' disappearance had shifted into what law enforcement calls a long-term missing child case. The arrest warrant for her mother, Rosa Maria Tenorio, remained active, and Andrea was still listed in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC database. But despite those measures, the investigation had reached a standstill. From 2006 onward, the case grew increasingly cold. International parental abductions are among the hardest cases to resolve, and Andrea's disappearance demonstrated why. Without digital tracking systems or widespread use of forensic tools, Rosa had been able to disappear in Mexico without leaving many traces. Leads that had once seemed promising faded, and there were fewer and fewer updates to follow. For law enforcement, Andrea's file was kept open but inactive. Detectives acknowledged the case but had little to work with. They could not force another country to act without clear evidence of Rosa's location, and the trail had been cold for years. Andrea's name appeared on missing child registries, but no one knew where she was or what kind of life she was living. For Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, however, these years were anything but quiet. While official progress was scarce, he continued to speak about Andrea and push for awareness. In interviews and conversations with advocates, Carlos explained that he never gave up hope. Every year, he marked Andrea's birthdays and anniversaries of her disappearance, reminding the world that she was still missing. Carlos reached out to organizations, renewed missing child posters, and connected with other families facing similar struggles. He understood the reality that his daughter might not be found quickly, but he refused to let her memory fade. For him, Andrea was not just a file number in a system. She was his daughter, and she was out there somewhere. The emotional toll of these years was heavy. Families of long-term missing children often describe the pain as living without answers. Without confirmation of life or death, there is no closure. For Carlos, the uncertainty defined his daily life. He lived with the constant question, where is Andrea? Meanwhile, the world around the case was changing. Between 2006 and 2019, major advancements in forensic science and communication began to take shape. DNA technology became more powerful, genealogical databases emerged, and international cooperation in some criminal cases improved. But Andrea's case remained stuck, waiting for the right tools and the right investigators to reopen it. For the broader public, Andrea's disappearance faded from memory. Stranger abduction cases often received more media coverage, while parental abductions like hers rarely stayed in headlines for long. Without regular updates, Andrea's name was less recognized outside of missing child advocacy groups. Yet within her family, Andrea's story was very much alive. Carlos's persistence set him apart. Even after a decade, he continued to make appeals and to hope for new leads. His belief that Andrea was alive never wavered, even when years passed without progress. By 2019, Andrea had been missing for 20 years. For many cases, that much time would mean the end of any realistic chance of resolution. But Carlos's devotion and the existence of an active warrant against Rosa meant Andrea's story was not completely forgotten. The groundwork was still there, waiting for the day when technology and determination could finally bring answers. These long, cold years were defined by silence from law enforcement, fading public memory, and unending hope from a father who never stopped searching. They were years of waiting, of carrying the weight of uncertainty, and of preparing, without knowing it, for the breakthroughs that would finally arrive in the next decade. The reopening, 2023. By 2023, Andrea Michelle Reyes had been missing for nearly 25 years. For most people outside her family, hers was a case that had quietly faded from public view. But inside the New Haven Police Department, one detective decided it was time to take another look. That detective was Keelan Nevakoff. Detective Nevakoff specialized in cold cases and believed that many of them still had a chance if new tools were applied. Andrea's disappearance was one of those cases. Even though she had been taken in 1999, Nevakoff saw opportunities in the advances that had reshaped investigative work since then. The most important change was the rise of forensic genealogy. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, this method had solved dozens of cases once thought unsolvable. By analyzing DNA and connecting it to family members through genealogical databases, investigators could identify victims and sometimes even locate missing persons. Andrea's case was particularly suited for this approach. Authorities already had DNA from her father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, and other relatives. The challenge was finding whether Andrea, or someone directly connected to her, could be matched through modern technology. In 2023, Detective Nevakoff partnered with Othram, a Texas-based forensic laboratory known for solving difficult cold cases. Othram had built a reputation for using advanced DNA sequencing and genealogy to crack cases that had been stagnant for decades. With their expertise, investigators believed Andrea's case had a real chance of progress. The process was not immediate. Genealogical DNA work is painstaking, requiring careful analysis and verification. But for the first time in over 2 decades, there was hope of an answer. Andrea's information was run through the systems, and the team waited for possible leads. Meanwhile, Carlos continued to cooperate with investigators. Even after so many years, he provided information and support. For him, the reopening of the case was a sign that the search for Andrea was not over. He had carried her memory for decades, and now professionals were giving her story new life. The significance of reopening Andrea's case went beyond her family. It was part of a broader movement in law enforcement to re-examine old files using modern science. Across the country, cases from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s were being solved with tools that hadn't existed when the crimes occurred. Andrea's story fit into that pattern, showing that even parental abductions could benefit from forensic genealogy. Detective Novikov spoke publicly about the importance of persistence in these cases. She explained that while resources are often limited, technology has changed the landscape. What once seemed impossible, tracking someone across borders after decades, was now within reach. By late 2023, there were promising results. Through DNA and genealogical research, investigators believed they had located Andrea in Puebla, Mexico. The next steps required careful verification. International coordination was necessary to confirm her identity and ensure the evidence was solid. This reopening marked a turning point in the story. After decades of silence and frustration, there was finally momentum. The combination of persistence from her father, determination from a detective, and the application of new technology had brought the case back into the light. For the first time since 1999, Andrea's family had reason to believe that answers were close. The work that began in 2023 would soon lead to the confirmation that Andrea was alive and that the mystery of her disappearance was nearing resolution. Breakthrough. Found in Mexico. In early 2024, the investigative work on Andrea Michelle Reyes' case reached a critical moment. After months of DNA analysis and genealogical research conducted by Othram, investigators in New Haven were notified that a strong lead had emerged. The data suggested that Andrea, who had been missing since 1999, was alive and living in Puebla, Mexico. This information had to be verified carefully. International cases require multiple layers of confirmation before authorities can make any public announcements. With the assistance of Mexican officials, the process of locating Andrea quietly began. Investigators sought to ensure that the person in Puebla truly was Andrea before informing her family. The breakthrough came when DNA samples were compared directly against those of her father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier. The results were conclusive. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, it was confirmed that Andrea Michelle Reyes, the toddler who had vanished from New Haven in 1999, had been found. In March 2025, officials announced the discovery publicly. News outlets such as the Associated Press and The Guardian reported that Andrea, now 27 years old, had been positively identified. She had spent nearly her entire life in Mexico after being taken by her mother, Rosa Maria Tenorio, who remained a fugitive wanted on federal kidnapping charges. For law enforcement, the confirmation was a rare success story in a category of cases that often remain unresolved. Parental abductions that cross international borders can stretch on indefinitely, leaving families in limbo. The fact that Andrea had been located after 25 years highlighted both the persistence of investigators and the power of modern forensic science. For Carlos, the news brought an end to decades of searching. Reports describe him as overwhelmed with emotion when he learned the truth. He had lived for years believing that Andrea was alive, but confirmation was something different. Now, after 25 years of uncertainty, he finally had proof that his daughter had survived. Andrea's identification raised other questions. What had her life been like in Mexico? How much did she know about her disappearance? Out of respect for her privacy, officials released limited details. They confirmed that she had been living in Puebla, but much of her personal life was kept confidential. What mattered most to her family in Connecticut was that she had been found. Meanwhile, Rosa Maria Tenorio remained at large. The U.S. Department of Justice confirmed that she was still wanted for kidnapping. International arrest warrants were in place, but locating and extraditing her posed challenges. For investigators, Andrea's safe identification was the priority, but the legal case against her mother was still unresolved. The public reaction to Andrea's discovery was significant. Across the U.S., families of other missing children took hope from the story. It showed that even after decades, answers were possible. Media outlets emphasized that Andrea E.'s case was one of the longest-running child abduction cases in Connecticut E.'s history to be resolved with a living child found. Forensic experts also pointed to the case as an example of how genealogical DNA could be used in more than just homicide investigations. While the method had been widely publicized for solving cold case murders, Andrea's story demonstrated that it could also reunite families separated for decades. By the spring of 2025, Andrea had reconnected with her father and relatives. It was not an easy transition. 25 years apart could not be erased overnight, but it marked the beginning of healing. For Carlos, the wait was finally over. His daughter, taken as a toddler, had been found alive. The breakthrough closed one of the most painful chapters in Connecticut's missing child history. It was the result of persistence, science, and the unshakable determination of a father who never stopped believing his daughter would one day be found. The reunion. When investigators confirmed in early 2025 that Andrea Michelle Reyes was alive in Puebla, Mexico, the first step was to notify her father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier. After 25 years of waiting, Carlos finally heard the words he had hoped for. His daughter had been found. Reports describe his reaction as a mixture of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. For more than 2 decades, Carlos had celebrated Andrea's birthdays without her, held on to photographs from her infancy, and carried the weight of unanswered questions. Now, after all those years, he was given something many parents of missing children never receive: proof that his child was alive. The first contacts between Andrea and Carlos were careful. After 25 years apart, both had lived separate lives. Andrea had grown up in Mexico, far removed from her early years in Connecticut. Carlos, on the other hand, had spent those years searching, waiting, and hoping. Bridging that distance required patience and sensitivity. Authorities facilitated the reconnection process, ensuring that Andrea had the choice and the space to engage with her father. According to reports, Andrea reached out and began speaking with Carlos. For him, hearing her voice as an adult after last seeing her as a toddler was an experience that words could barely describe. The reunion was not only emotional, but also complex. Andrea was 27 years old by the time she was identified. She had built her own life in Mexico, shaped by her upbringing there. Returning to the United States or adjusting to her father's world was not immediate. Instead, their reunion began with conversations, video calls, and cautious steps toward rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted for so long. For Carlos, the priority was not to erase the lost years, but to embrace the new beginning. He spoke publicly about his gratitude and about the relief of knowing Andrea was safe. After living with uncertainty for so long, the confirmation of her survival was enough to begin healing. For Andrea, the discovery of her true identity was a turning point. She had lived most of her life without knowledge of the circumstances of her disappearance. Being identified as Andrea Michelle Reyes meant reclaiming a part of her past that had been hidden for decades. While details of her personal response remained private, the confirmation gave her the opportunity to reconnect with the family she had been separated from. The reunion also carried a wider meaning. For families of missing children across the country, Andrea's case was proof that hope could last for decades. Her father's persistence showed that even after years of silence, answers were possible. The reunion symbolized not only the closing of one family's search, but also the possibility of resolution for many others still waiting. Though Andrea and Carlos could not recover the years lost, their reconnection was a rare outcome in cases like this. Many international parental abduction cases end without closure, leaving families permanently separated. Andrea's identification and reunion with her father was the kind of resolution that most families in similar situations long for but never experience. The journey toward rebuilding their relationship continues. A reunion after 25 years is not a single moment but an ongoing process. For Andrea and Carlos, it began with confirmation, followed by communication, and the hope of a future where father and daughter could once again share their lives. The reunion of Andrea and her father stands as one of the most powerful outcomes of this long case. After a quarter century of absence, Two lives that had been forced apart were brought back together through persistence, science, and the enduring strength of family bonds. Legal and social impact. While the discovery of Andrea Michelle Reyes brought relief and closure to her family, the case also highlighted ongoing legal challenges. The woman accused of taking her, Rosa Maria Tenorio, remains a fugitive. Federal authorities in the United States confirmed that she is still wanted on charges of kidnapping stemming from October 1999. One of the key difficulties in cases like Andrea's is extradition. When a U.S. citizen takes a child across international borders, cooperation between countries is essential. In the late 1990s, enforcement of the Hague Convention on International Child Abduction was inconsistent, especially in cases involving Mexico. Even today, extraditing suspects can be complex, requiring diplomatic agreements and extensive legal procedures. Rosa's exact whereabouts have not been disclosed, and it remains unclear whether she will ever face trial in the United States. Andrea's identification in 2025 demonstrated the strengths and weaknesses of the system. On one hand, modern forensic genealogy gave investigators a tool powerful enough to resolve a case that had been cold for decades. Without it, Andrea might still be missing today. On the other hand, the fact that Rosa could disappear for so long illustrates the gaps that still exist in international parental abduction cases. For law enforcement and advocacy groups, Andrea's case became a teaching example. It showed that persistence, combined with science, can lead to breakthroughs. At the same time, it reminded officials that more work is needed to prevent similar cases from lasting decades. Missing child organizations pointed out that stronger cross-border cooperation is essential to ensuring that abductions are resolved more quickly. Socially, the case carried an important message for other families of missing children. Andrea's story reached the news around the world because it was so rare. After 25 years, she was found alive. For families still searching, this brought renewed hope. It showed that time alone does not erase the possibility of answers. At the same time, Andrea's discovery highlighted the emotional complexity of reunions after decades. While Carlos was overjoyed to see his daughter again, both he and Andrea had lived separate lives. Adjusting to that reality is a long process. For the public, this served as a reminder that recovery is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Legally unresolved and socially impactful, Andrea's case underscored both the progress and the challenges in handling international parental kidnappings. It is now regarded as one of the most remarkable long-term child recovery cases in recent history. Legacy of the case. The case of Andrea Michelle Reyes is more than a story of disappearance and discovery. It stands as a lasting example of how persistence, technology, and family devotion can intersect to change outcomes that once seemed impossible. For Andrea herself, the most important part of this legacy is the restoration of her identity. For 25 years, she lived without connection to her father, separated from her family in the United States. In official records, she was listed as missing, and for her father, she existed only in memory and hope. When DNA testing confirmed her identity in 2025, Andrea was no longer just a name on a missing child poster. She was recognized once again as a daughter, a relative, and a survivor of abduction. For Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, the legacy is one of persistence. Few parents could continue a search with such determination over decades. Every year, Carlos kept Andrea's case alive. He never stopped contacting authorities, never stopped asking questions, and never let her memory fade. His commitment ensured that when technology finally advanced far enough, Andrea's case was ready to be reopened and resolved. The case also represents a milestone in the use of forensic genealogy. Much attention has been given to this technology in solving cold case homicides, but Andrea's identification showed its wider potential. It demonstrated that DNA could be used not only to name the dead, but also to reunite the living. This broadened the way investigators, advocates, and families think about the possibilities of modern science. For the wider community, Andrea's story has a symbolic weight. Families of missing children often struggle with fading attention and limited resources. Andrea's recovery after 25 years proves that even the longest cases can be resolved. Her story has already been shared as a source of hope for other families waiting for answers. At the same time, Andrea's case serves as a reminder of the need for stronger systems to prevent similar cases. International parental abductions continue to happen each year, and many remain unresolved. Andrea's recovery highlights what is possible, but it also shows how much more could be done to protect children and to enforce custody rulings across borders. In the end, the legacy of Andrea Michelle Reyes is one of hope and proof. Hope, because her discovery offers encouragement to families still searching. Proof, because her case shows that determination and science together can bring resolution, even after decades. The story of Andrea Michelle Reyes began in 1999 with a disappearance that left her family searching for answers. For her father, Carlos Reyes-Couvertier, the years that followed were filled with waiting, hoping, and refusing to give up. For more than 2 decades, Andrea was listed as a missing child. Her photo remained in databases, her name stayed in police files, and her father continued to speak of her. The case survived because of persistence, even when progress seemed unlikely. In 2023, a new generation of investigators reopened the file. With the help of forensic genealogy and modern DNA technology, Andrea was finally identified in Puebla, Mexico. In 2025, authorities confirmed what her father had always believed: Andrea was alive. The reunion between Andrea and her father was a rare outcome in international parental abduction cases. Many families never receive closure, and many children remain missing for life. Andrea's return showed that time does not erase the possibility of answers. Her case became one of Connecticut's longest-running child abductions to be resolved, and one of the few with the victim found alive decades later. Yet Andrea's story also reminds us of the work still to be done. Her mother, Rosa Maria Tenorio, remains a fugitive. Legal systems continue to face challenges in handling international abductions, and families of missing children still endure years of uncertainty, waiting for breakthroughs that may or may not come. Andrea's discovery is not just a conclusion but a continuation, a reminder of resilience, of the power of science, and of a father's devotion that lasted a lifetime. After 25 years, Andrea was no longer missing. She was home in the sense that mattered most. She had been found, and her name and story had been restored.